This is an armaments breakdown in Rise of Kingdoms. With a lot of discussion on armaments in the Discord going on right now, I wanted to revisit this topic in detail. So in today's video, we are covering the base mechanics of armaments, including what your best available stats are for each slot, how to choose formations based on your commander's kit, and how to set up your dispatch and travel focus to get the best results for the short and the long term. Without further ado, let's get started. First, let's talk about base mechanics. Armaments come with 3 stats, each of which are locked to a specific slot. The first spot has attack and march speed. The second slot has defense, and the third slot has either health or damage. Note that this is for each of the main troop types, so you can have cavalry attack, infantry attack, archer attack, or siege attack, or any of those march speeds in that first slot. So this is where you get some level of change, but you will only have attack in that first slot. You won't have it in the second or third. There are some other stats you do get, but I'm going to omit them because they're not really useful to combat. The other part of armaments are inscriptions. Inscriptions serve as an additional bonus and are specifically locked to a name. Armored has the same ability on the Olympia's Chorus Master, on every wedge formation, on every single armament that has it. It's not like you're going to have 3.2% or 3.8%. It's always 3.5% when it's equipped to a legendary one. However, they do have some carryover. There are some similar items that have basically the same stat under different names in different slots. For example, under Epics of Olympia, it might have a different name, but the same bonus. Or if it's under the Arch Formation version of either of these. They might have the same bonus, but they might have a slightly different name. This means that you can get generally the same stats, it's just a different set of names. In addition, each formation has its own set of special inscriptions that are tied to that commander's type of kit. So wedge formation ones, for example, are tied to skill damage and dealing more of it. And these are locked to this specific formation and legendaries only. There are also blue versions that are slightly toned down. It's a percentage, but the same overall concept. But overall, this is the base of where you get the bulk of your stats. And of course, the only other way you get the stats is from the base value. So Wedge gives you 5% skill damage, Arch gives you 5% normal damage, and so on and so forth. These are granted to you regardless of if you have 0 armaments or 4. If you equip it to that commander, you get that bonus outright. You don't need to fill all the slots. Some other mechanics you need to keep in mind is that only the primary commander works for the armaments and inscriptions. So just like equipment, it's only going to matter on the primary, and you don't need to set your secondary commander up with anything extra, because it will not impact your trade. Another thing that is available on legendary armaments is the ability to re-roll your base stats, but only if the legendary armament is inscribed. This means that if you have a great inscription on a bad base armament, you can then re-roll the stats to get them all in your specialty. And that's how most players end up with a setup like this that is all one stat. And this is something you want to work towards the end game, and you can optimize a little more. But overall, the more stats you can get rolling towards your main troop focus, the better. But it is not an absolute game breaker, especially for field players. Generally speaking, if you're looking at getting one set the best, you can do that. But overall, a generalist approach for field commanders is probably your best option, because you can have more impact overall if you can get more of the stats on one specific commander, sure, but you can also then get all 4 of your commanders to be good instead of one to be just great. But if your role you want to have is going to be more about garrison, it's more about optimizing, and rallies the same. For example, damage is more important than health, but both are good. So if you get health, you don't necessarily need to rush damage, but it's certainly going to help you more in the long run. One last mechanic I want to touch base on is that I'm not really cover in a huge amount of detail is the armament shop here, where you can buy these inscriptions. So these can be bought by getting 180 gold tokens, which is gained by recycling gold armaments. So this takes an incredibly long amount of time, so it's not something you're going to be having in the short term. However, if you do get one of these inscriptions, you can then apply them to an armament. If you do this, it will remove any other inscriptions already placed on that armament. So do not ever do this with a specialty inscription or a blue inscription, because they're the most powerful and there is not a single one of these that is worthwhile to get rid of for that specialty inscription. So just save yourself the headache and save yourself the heartache of losing one of the best inscriptions in the game. While this is by no means extensive, I wanted to make sure I covered as many of these important questions and topics, and I'll be going over some more in detail here in a bit, but in general, these are the most important mechanics you need to keep in mind as you are building your stock of armaments and upgrading them. Now that we have talked about armaments in general, let's talk about optimizing the stats. There are two things you need to be optimizing. One, you need to optimize the armament stats themselves to your troop type, and two, you need to be optimizing the inscription stats to your role. First, let's talk about the armament stats. As I mentioned at the start, there are a handful of stats that can go into each slot. I'm going to start slot by slot and talk about which ones are the best in these situations. First, of course, in the first slot, attack is your best option. You can go march speed, but it's a trade-off and it's not something I recommend for rallies or garrisons. It's something that you could definitely go with if you're in the field though. That being said, this is probably the weakest of the stats and the lowest priority to get perfect because it's just such a small impact at a couple percentage points. If you look at mine, you see it's 6.1%, and that's for all four. You pretty much exclusively want defense in the second slot. The other stats in the slot are just not very useful, so defense easily takes the top spot. It's just kind of solid overall. There's not a lot of fancy things to say here in that case, it's just defense is the best option. Lastly, the third spot, you have some options, and really the best of the best is all damage, because it's so good, but health is also an option. But with the rise of smite damage commanders, all damage is huge, so all damage dealt is actually what I recommend in general if you're wanting to optimize stats. However, if you do have health, it's really not the end of the world, because it's an excellent defensive stat. Both are good, but if you want to optimize each of these stats for whatever your intended main troop type is, if you're a cavalry player, you want to go all cavalry stats. Each infantry stat is not benefiting you, because they're not doing you any good because you're not having infantry in that mix. There is some exception with mixed defenses, but you're still suboptimal, because you're only getting 15% of your units buffed instead of the 70% that your actual lead is. Same goes for archers or infantry if you are that kind of main. In mixed defenses, you have some more leeway, as I said, but you want to keep your main troop type, that mixed defense, is the primary focus, because you want to have that optimized as best as possible. This is where all damage is great too, because it buffs all your marches, even if you have 33% of each one. In fully mixed defenses with Hera or Lapu, you have some extra space to work with, but armament stats are notoriously hard to optimize for these defenses, and besides the all damage, there really isn't much that really benefits mixed defenses in general. Next, for inscriptions, you want to have the specialty or blue reduced versions as often as possible. On this set, you can see I have 2 of them, and that really comes to be a huge benefit for my trade. These are some of the most optimal inscriptions you can have for those formations, because they are specifically tailored to that formation and that formation's overall goal. All the wedge ones are the best for skill damage, all the arch ones are best for normal damage, and so on and so forth. So getting these inscriptions should be your first priority, and if you cannot get them, your best option is to focus on damage reduction, then damage dealt, then health, defense, and attack in that order, as it is the most optimal setup in terms of efficiency, because it gives you the better chance to stay alive and have more damage to deal back. The more damage reduction you can stack, the better, but it's especially true if you are a garrison or rally player. For field, you have a little bit more wiggle room, and if you have specialty inscriptions and you are a rally or garrison player, they should get the priority in terms of the specialty inscriptions. There isn't a lot that are unique to specific formations. Most of them are just under different names. Armored comes to mind. They have a version of Armored on basically every inscription. But overall, these are going to be the best ones anyway, because most of the ones that are kind of unique, but are not the specialty or the blue ones, are just kind of mediocre. As a general good rule of thumb, though, to prioritize damage reduction, then damage dealt, and then the base stats in order like you would for equipment. Next, we'll talk about how to select a formation based on your commander's kit. First, I'll cover the elephant in the room. If you are not dealing normal damage, wedge is just generally the best overall, unless you have some special mechanic in your kit that utilizes a different formation. This means that 90% of your formation use will be wedge. This is really attesting to how strong wedge formation is in general, but it's also just because skill damage is the main source of dealing damage right now. And whether you're a field, a rally, or a garrison, anything in between, skill damage is the primary damage unless you are a smite damage commander. For other commanders that don't deal skill damage, you pretty much are going to be using Arch if you're dealing normal damage. So this is your Gorgo, your Constantine, your Zenobia, your Scipio Milianus, William Wallace, Liu Che, or anybody else in the future that uses normal damage to deal their most common source, whether that's normal damage in terms of attack, counterattack, or smite damage. This is basically the opposite version of wedge, where it's the same optimization, but it's more oriented around that normal damage. For commanders that use a lot of shielding and shield time, Hollow Square is an option. This is primarily Heraclius right now, but more shielding commanders could be coming in the future. There's a big debate between Hollow Square and Testudo, and from looking at the inscriptions and doing some math, the difference comes down to how much uptime you have on your shield. If you have more than 40% shield uptime, Hollow Square is the better option. Otherwise, Testudo is better. With the rise of healing commanders, if you have a healing and shielding commander, Testudo is also better in that case. But it's not something that is active in the game right now. I will skip over V formation, as it is specific to ranged combat, and it's about as far as I need to go on that, because you're not going to be using it outside of ranged combatants. But circle formation is ideal for healing commanders, which there aren't a lot of right now. But there may be some on the horizon based on the current leaks. Echelon is ideal for percentage-based buffs, but not for debuffs or rage gain. This is most ideal for William the Conqueror's defense buff and Joan Prime's damage buff, but most notably for Trajan. Triple line is pretty much used for mobility, so it's mostly for rune gatherers, and in terms of actual combat, it's really not used outside of maybe farm hunting on occasion. Delta formation is something I'm just going to have to cover in another video because we just do not have enough time here, but I'll be covering it in the future. And the rest of the formations are more or less niche to either filling garrisons or rallies, or for gathering specifically, so I won't cover them as a true combat formation. Now that we have covered the choosing the best formation for your commanders, let's cover the main ways to generate those. And that's dispatch and travel. The dispatch and travel system is the main source of armaments outside of the random boxes you get from events, and the only real way to get higher quality armaments consistently. You have up to 8 dispatches a day and up to 20 travels depending on the level of your state forum. So as you increase, you get more daily travels and more daily dispatches. You really start to cap out at about 20. The extra 2 travels and the extra 1 dispatch don't make a huge difference. So if you get to there, you don't necessarily need to rush, besides the fact that you are going to be getting dispatches and travels that give you the Sage's Testimony. So that means you're missing out on armaments then. Dispatches are specific to requirements. You can pick them out and you can pick which armament you're going to get, but they each come with their own specific requirement. But if you have all of the epic commanders maxed out and you have them at a decent level and you have some legendaries you're starting to build, you really don't have any trouble getting them all sent at once, even if you have all 8. However, you aren't required to send them all at once. So if you want to send a few out, refresh, and send some more out later, you can definitely do that hoping for a legendary dispatch. But at worst, you just grab that legendary dispatch the next day since they'll still be there. For travels, you have special themes that do give you an increased chance to get better drops. So you can look here, and overall you have these special ones here that give you a slightly increased chance, or an increased luck chance overall. But in general, it's just kind of a slightly higher chance. You're going to get good results either way. And even if you don't have the legendary ones, a lot of times they have at least 1 epic. So if you have the epics, that's great. And then as you build them up, you will be getting originally probably more from the travel. But as you build up the dispatches, you can get more control because the 15 dispatches do eventually give you a guaranteed drop of an epic or above. And you'll see the percentages, you'll see the chances here. And the percentages are still slated towards epic, but that's where you're going to get a lot more of the better armaments in the long run. Now that we've talked about the mechanics, let's talk about how to select your 3 preferred formations. You want to select the formations that best suit your intended specialty. 90% of players are going to be using wedge for pretty much every situation, so I think everybody will pretty much have wedge here in at least one of these 3 spots, as everybody uses at least one commander with skill damage, even if you're an infantry. And particularly, a lot of smite damage commanders can use Arch if you're looking for more shielding commanders or something to go good with Hera. Hollow Square is a good option too. If you're building one of the new healing commanders or you're trying to get ahead of the ball for that, you could go into Circle or Testudo because both are able to utilize that healing. But overall, you're going to want to follow the strategy that I spoke of earlier where you're picking the formations. And you want to pick the 3 that best fit what you're trying to do with your commanders. So if you're trying to build commanders that are using wedge, which most of you will be, wedge is one of your preferred. And then whatever you're looking to do in the future. So once you get all the commanders you have built now on this list, on the preferred formations, the next ones you should look for are what you're anticipating is next. Hollow Square is a decent option. Testudo is also a decent option looking at what's on the horizon, because shielding appears to be getting more prevalent. Arch formation is a safe bet because they are leading more and more into arch formation, so that's one as well. As you can see on my screen, my personal preference is wedge, hollow square, arch, but I also used to have arch as echelon because I use a lot of Joan Prime, William, and Trajan, so I got a lot of benefit. But once you build up enough for that specific formation that you have your builds and you want to start focusing on something else, you could easily just change this on a moment's notice and kind of move along. And that's what I've done here, as you can see. I used to have echelon. I actually removed it and switched it out for arch because I had all my echelon formation setups the way I like it. And it's pretty much just going to give me stuff I'm going to recycle otherwise. And we'll cover recycling actually in a Boris tip of the week that's coming up here soon. But I can also cover it in a full video later on because recycling it is an interesting option because you want to build up those gold items for the inscription chest to eventually start being able to re-roll inscriptions on legendaries and get them where you want them. You might see some variety in personal use, but I think most players are going to be using wedge, and then the other 2 based on what you're trying to do. But with that, we will wrap up our base discussion on armaments. More will be coming with each specific formation. I'll be starting with wedge next, but I wanted to give a rough background of what to look for in general and some of the base mechanics that I don't want to be reiterating every single formation video, so we can get more in depth to the actual formations. But let me know in the comments, do you have a favorite formation that you prioritize? Or a stat you think is underappreciated in armaments? Let me know down in the comments. If you want to see me cover any other topic, let me know down in the comments as well, or join the Discord using the link in the description. And as always, good luck, fight well, and I will see you on the battlefield.